Dearest listeners, what could be more deliciously ironic than a man learning to love while teaching another how to capture his own heart? Today, this author brings you the most exquisite tale of misguided lessons that became the education of a lifetime. But let us not rush, for the best scandals, like the finest wine, must be savored properly. Lord Edmund Rothmore, Marquis of Rothmore, was, at 29, what society generously termed particular, and what this author would more accurately describe as insufferably arrogant. Blessed with the kind of dark beauty that made debutantes compose terrible poetry, eyes the color of winter storms, hair as black as India ink, and a jaw that could have been carved by Michelangelo in a particularly inspired moment. He possessed everything necessary to make him London's most sought-after bachelor. His wealth was so substantial that even the fortune hunters had given up calculating its extent, and his lineage could be traced back to the conquest without encountering a single tradesman or second son. Yet for all these advantages, Lord Edmund had developed the unfortunate habit of finding every young lady presented to him tediously predictable. This author witnessed him just last month at the Pemberton Musicale, suppressing yawns so elaborate they bordered on theatrical, whilst Lady Pemberton's accomplished daughter murdered a Mozart sonata with enthusiasm that far exceeded her skill. When asked his opinion of the performance, he declared it technically proficient but emotionally vacant, as if she were playing notes rather than music, causing Lady Pemberton to require immediate application of hartshorn and the poor girl to flee in tears. At Almack's, he had been overheard telling his friend Lord Ashworth that he could predict every word a debutante would speak before she opened her mouth. They would compliment the weather, profess a love of dancing that extended only as far as it allowed them to display their figures, claim to adore reading whilst never progressing beyond the first chapter of any improving work, and giggle at precise intervals regardless of whether anything amusing had been said. The man was, in short, impossible, which made it all the more amusing when his mother, the formidable Dowager Marchioness, a woman who could bend steel with her will alone, and had once made a duke apologize for existing too loudly in her presence, finally lost patience with his selective standards. The confrontation, this author learned from a well-placed lady's maid, was spectacular. The Dowager cornered Edmund in his study, a room he had foolishly believed sacrosanct, and delivered an ultimatum that would have made Wellington himself retreat. Either he would marry by season's end, or she would invoke certain provisions in his late father's will that would make his life distinctly uncomfortable. The exact nature of these provisions remains mysterious, but this author observed Edmund emerge from that study looking rather like a man who had just discovered his execution date. Within a fortnight, the betrothal was arranged with Miss Amelia Hartwell. The contract was signed before Edmund had even met the chit, a detail that would prove remarkably significant, gentle listeners. The match was considered brilliant by everyone except the two people most concerned with it. Miss Amelia Hartwell, at 19, was everything society deemed perfection. Golden curls that caught sunlight like spun honey, arranged in elaborate coiffures that must have required her maid to rise at dawn. Eyes the precise shade of a summer sky, fringed with lashes so long they cast shadows on her peaches and cream cheeks. Her figure was exactly what fashion demanded. A tiny waist that suggested she subsisted entirely on air and good breeding, combined with a décolletage that proved she didn't. She had been educated at the finest seminary for young ladies, where she had learned to paint watercolors of acceptable mediocrity, play the pianoforte without causing actual pain, sing sweetly if not memorably, and conduct conversation about weather for 3 hours without repetition. She could dance every dance without missing a step, curtsy to the precise angle required by any given rank, and smile continuously without ever revealing an actual thought. She was, this author must confess, spectacularly beautiful and monumentally bland. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, for this tale is not truly about Amelia at all. No, dearest listeners, this story belongs to Miss Josephine Hartwell, the middle sister who had perfected the art of invisibility through sheer necessity. At 24, Josephine occupied that peculiar purgatory reserved for middle children everywhere. Not beautiful enough to compete with Amelia's golden radiance, not vivacious enough to match their youngest sister Rose's effervescent charm, Josephine had long ago accepted her role as the practical one, the sensible one, the one who ensured her sister's gloves were clean and their dance cards properly maintained. This author had observed her for 3 seasons now, always in the background, always in brown or gray, colors that seemed designed to help her blend into the wallpaper or become one with the furniture. Her gowns were well made, but deliberately forgettable, cut to obscure rather than enhance, styled to suggest maiden aunt rather than marriageable miss. Her hair, an unremarkable shade between Amelia's gold and Rose's copper, though this author suspected it might gleam with hidden fires if ever released from its severe pins, was always scraped back so tightly it must have given her headaches. Her features, pleasant but not striking, were the sort that allowed people's gazes to slide past without stopping. She had cultivated the ability to move through a crowded ballroom without anyone remembering she had been there. Yet, and here is where our tale takes its first interesting turn, Josephine possessed something far more dangerous than beauty. She had intelligence sharp enough to cut glass, observation skills that would shame a spy, and a wicked sense of humor that she deployed so subtly most people never realized they had been its target. This author once observed her at a particularly tedious card party, standing behind her mother's chair. Lady Ashford was holding forth about the shocking decline in morals among the younger generation, citing as evidence a young lady who had dared to laugh too loudly at a garden party. Josephine's expression remained perfectly neutral, but she very deliberately moved Lady Ashford's teacup half an inch to the left, just as that lady reached for it without looking, causing her to fumble and, yes, laugh quite loudly indeed at her own clumsiness. The irony was lost on everyone except this author and, one suspects, Josephine herself. The first meeting between Edmund and his intended was a masterpiece of discomfort that this author had the pleasure of witnessing firsthand. It occurred in the Hartwell drawing room on a Tuesday afternoon that promised rain but delivered only oppressive humidity, the kind that made everyone irritable and caused carefully curled hair to wilt like week-old flowers. The Hartwell drawing room had been prepared with military precision. Every surface gleamed, every cushion had been plumped to mathematical perfection, and enough flowers had been arranged to stock a moderate-sized botanical garden. Mrs. Hartwell, a woman whose ambitions for her daughters exceeded even her impressive appetite for gossip, had positioned Amelia in a shaft of carefully calculated sunlight that turned her hair to molten gold and made her skin appear to glow from within. Edmund arrived precisely at 3, looking like a man approaching his execution with aristocratic dignity. He wore dark blue superfine that emphasized his broad shoulders, buff breeches that had clearly been crafted by a master, and a cravat tied in a style so complex, this author suspects it required an engineering degree to achieve. He was, in short, dressed to intimidate rather than impress. The introduction was performed with all proper ceremony. Edmund bowed correctly, his face revealing nothing more than polite acknowledgement. Amelia performed the requisite curtsy and blushing smile, though this author noticed the blush had been enhanced with a subtle application of rouge. They were seated at precise distances, close enough to suggest intimacy, far enough to maintain complete propriety. What followed was 20 minutes of the most exquisitely painful conversation this author has ever endured. Edmund would ask a question about her interests, his tone suggesting he was reading from an invisible list of appropriate topics. Amelia would provide an answer so vapid it seemed to physically pain him. She enjoyed music, she declared. All music, every type equally, with no preference whatsoever. When pressed for specifics, she added that she found it all wonderfully musical. Edmund's left eye developed a slight twitch. She loved to read, she assured him, whatever was fashionable, nothing too taxing on the mind. When he inquired about her favorite author, she brightened and said she enjoyed them all equally, as books were so very bookish. The twitch spread to his jaw. She adored dancing, all dances, no preferences whatsoever, each as delightful as the last. When he asked if she preferred the waltz to the quadrille, she smiled sweetly and said she couldn't possibly choose as they both involved such lovely stepping. Edmund's fingers began drumming an increasingly agitated rhythm on his thigh, a percussion of frustration that grew more pronounced with each exchange. This author observed the exact moment Edmund began contemplating whether the provisions in his father's will could possibly be worse than a lifetime of such conversation. His eyes had taken on a glazed quality, the look of a man watching his future stretch before him in an endless succession of discussions about weather, fashion, and the comparative merits of different types of ribbon. It was then that Josephine entered, carrying the tea service because the maid had twisted her ankle, or so she claimed, though this author suspects the servants had developed a sudden epidemic of injuries to avoid the tension in the drawing room. Josephine moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being overlooked, her gray afternoon dress rendering her almost invisible against the pale walls. She began the elaborate ritual of tea service, and it was then that something extraordinary happened. Amelia, in response to Edmund's query about her thoughts on the current political situation, declared that she tried not to think about such things as they were so very political. The statement was so magnificently absurd that Josephine's hand paused for just a fraction of a second in its pouring, her lips twitching with suppressed amusement. Edmund noticed. Oh, how he noticed. His eyes, which had been unfocused with boredom, suddenly sharpened like a hawk spotting prey. He watched as Josephine completed the pour with perfect precision, not a drop spilled despite her obvious struggle not to laugh. When she handed him his tea, prepared exactly as he preferred, 1 sugar, no milk, stirred counterclockwise 3 times without having asked, their eyes met for one brief, electric moment. In that instant, this author saw something pass between them, a shared recognition of the absurdity of the situation, a mutual understanding that they were both trapped in this elaborate farce. It was the look of 2 people discovering they spoke the same language in a room full of foreigners. Edmund's attention remained divided for the rest of the visit. While he maintained the facade of conversing with Amelia, his gaze tracked Josephine as she moved silently around the room, adjusting a flower here, straightening a cushion there, always present, but never acknowledged. This author noticed how his eyes lingered on her hands as she worked, capable hands that moved with purpose rather than ornament, and how he seemed to lean slightly in her direction whenever she passed near. 3 days later, the entire Hartwell household was thrown into uproar by a confession that would change everything. Amelia, sweet, guileless Amelia, revealed that she had fallen desperately in love with Mr. James Morrison, the vicar's eldest son. The confession came tumbling out in the Hartwell garden, witnessed by this author from behind a conveniently placed rose arbor. One must maintain one's sources, after all. The day was uncommonly fine, the sort of perfect English afternoon that occurs perhaps twice a year and makes one forget the other 363 days of drizzle and disappointment. Amelia had gathered her family for what they assumed would be wedding planning. Instead, she burst into tears. Pretty tears, naturally, the kind that made her eyes sparkle rather than redden, and confessed everything. Mr. Morrison, she explained between delicate sobs, was everything she had ever dreamed of. He was kind, gentle, thoughtful, and most importantly, he never expected her to have opinions about things she didn't understand. The revelation about their secret courtship was even more shocking. They had been meeting in the churchyard every Tuesday while supposedly visiting the poor. Their romance had blossomed over discussions of flower arrangements for the altar and the proper way to organize charity baskets. He had written her poetry, terrible poetry from what this author gathered, but Amelia found it wonderful because she could understand every word. Mrs. Hartwell's reaction was everything one might expect. She clutched her chest, called for her salts, declared herself betrayed, bewailed the loss of a marchioness's coronet, and then fainted with admirable theatrical precision onto a conveniently placed settee. Mr. Hartwell, a man whose primary contribution to any crisis was to retreat to his study with a brandy, did exactly that. Rose, the youngest, clapped her hands with delight at the drama before being hushed by a governess. It was Josephine who proposed the solution, and this author must confess to nearly revealing her hiding spot with an inadvertent gasp at the girl's audacity. While her mother was being revived with burnt feathers and her father was fortifying himself with spirits, Josephine calmly suggested teaching Amelia how to make Edmund fall in love with her. The logic, she explained, with the sort of practical sense that had always characterized her, was simple. If Lord Edmund genuinely cared for Amelia, he might be willing to release her from the engagement without scandal when she confessed her true feelings. A man in love would want his beloved's happiness above his own pride. If he didn't fall in love with her, well, the engagement would proceed as planned, and at least Amelia would know she had tried. This author cannot help but wonder, however, if there was not perhaps another motivation lurking beneath Josephine's practical facade, a motivation so deeply buried that even she remained unaware of it. For was it not curious that a woman who had spent 3 years carefully avoiding the notice of every eligible gentleman should suddenly volunteer to study one so intensively? Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a part of Miss Josephine Hartwell that simply wished for an excuse to understand the enigmatic Lord Edmund, to explore the workings of a mind that had dismissed every other young lady as tedious. But I digress into speculation, though this author's speculations have an uncanny habit of proving accurate. The flaw in this plan, obvious to everyone except 2 young ladies desperate to avoid disaster, was that it assumed Edmund could be made to fall in love with Amelia at all. The lessons began the following Monday. This author, through careful cultivation of a friendship with the Hartwells' parlor-maid, a delightful girl named Sally, who proved remarkably susceptible to bribes of ribbon and compliments, managed to witness several of these extraordinary sessions. They took place in the morning room, a cheerful space decorated in yellow silk that Mrs. Hartwell believed suggested prosperity, but actually suggested nothing so much as the inside of an egg. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, revealing dust motes dancing like tiny conspirators in the air, and highlighting the determined expression on Josephine's usually placid face. It became immediately apparent that Josephine had studied Edmund with the dedication of a naturalist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. She had somehow discovered, through means this author has yet to uncover but deeply admires, his every preference, habit, and inclination. She knew he preferred Wordsworth to Byron, finding the latter too self-indulgent and the former more connected to genuine feeling. She knew he took his tea with 1 sugar, never 2, stirred counterclockwise precisely 3 times, and left to stand for 30 seconds before drinking. She knew he had a particular weakness for women who could discuss philosophy without simpering, who understood the difference between wit and mere cleverness, who could maintain eye contact whilst disagreeing with him. The first lesson focused on conversation. Josephine had prepared like a general planning a campaign. She had lists of topics that would engage him, examples of questions that showed genuine interest rather than social obligation, and even a collection of opinions that were controversial enough to be interesting, but not so radical as to be improper. She would play Edmund whilst Amelia practiced, and this author nearly betrayed herself with laughter at Josephine's uncanny impression of his lordship's measured, slightly sardonic tone. She captured perfectly his habit of pausing before responding to any question, as if weighing whether the asker deserved an answer. She mimicked his way of tilting his head when skeptical, of raising one eyebrow when amused, of drumming his fingers when impatient. But Amelia, bless her heart, was hopeless. When Josephine as Edmund asked her opinion on the Catholic emancipation question, Amelia responded that she supposed Catholics should be emancipated if they were unhappy. But wouldn't it be better if everyone could just be Church of England and save all the fuss? Josephine's expression at this response was a masterpiece of controlled despair that this author shall treasure forever. Here, gentle listeners, is where fate began to weave its delicious web. For Edmund, suspicious of Amelia's sudden transformation from vapid to marginally interesting during their official calls, began arriving early. He would slip into the house through the servants' entrance, bribing the footman, this author discovered, with enough coin to keep the man in gin for a month, and position himself where he could observe these lessons undetected. The second week brought lessons in gesture and movement. Josephine demonstrated how Edmund responded to subtle, rather than overt displays, explaining that he found obvious attempts at seduction vulgar and desperate. She showed Amelia how to pour tea with deliberate grace, not the affected delicacy of a china doll, but the confident efficiency of a woman who knew her own worth. This author observed Edmund watching from behind a barely cracked door as Josephine moved through these demonstrations. She showed Amelia how to let her hand rest on a book as if unconsciously drawn to knowledge, fingers tracing the spine with genuine affection rather than performance. She demonstrated the precise angle to tilt one's head when listening, not the vacant bird-like tilt of incomprehension, but the thoughtful angle of someone truly considering what was being said. When Josephine demonstrated how to hand a gentleman his tea, meeting his eyes directly, holding the saucer with steady hands, allowing the briefest moment of shared contact, Edmund's knuckles went white as he gripped the door frame. The third week's lesson proved even more illuminating. Josephine was teaching Amelia about poetry, explaining Edmund's favorite passages and what they revealed about his nature. She had brought a worn copy of Wordsworth's collected works, the margins filled with notes in her neat hand. She recited Tintern Abbey with such genuine feeling, such understanding of its deeper meanings, that even Amelia stopped fidgeting to listen. When she reached the lines about the burden of the mystery, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, her eyes distant, as if she truly understood what it meant to feel the weight of unintelligible thoughts. Edmund, this author later learned from the footman, nearly revealed himself by stepping forward when Josephine explained that Edmund likely connected with Wordsworth's sense of isolation, of feeling separated from others by thoughts and sensibilities they couldn't share. She spoke of loneliness in a crowded room, of the exhaustion of constantly translating oneself into simpler terms for others' consumption, of the desperate hunger to find just one person who understood without explanation. She was, in that moment, not teaching Amelia about Edmund at all. She was revealing her own heart, and Edmund, watching from the shadows, recognized a kindred spirit. The footman later confided to this author's most reliable source that when his lordship departed that afternoon, he seemed so profoundly shaken that he walked directly into the garden gate, a gate he had successfully navigated for the past 5 weeks without incident. The man further reported that Edmund stood in the street for a full minute, staring back at the house as if trying to memorize something precious he feared might vanish. Such was the power of Miss Josephine's unconscious revelation that it had rendered the usually composed Marquess as clumsy as a green boy experiencing his first infatuation. The fourth week brought the most dangerous lesson of all: physical proximity. Josephine explained that Edmund withdrew from aggressive pursuit, but might be drawn by strategic retreat. She spoke of creating a sense of absence that made one's presence more valuable, of being near without imposing, of creating moments of accidental contact that felt natural rather than calculated. This author will never forget watching Josephine demonstrate the art of proximity. She showed Amelia how to stand just close enough that Edmund would be aware of her presence. The faint scent of lavender water, the rustle of silk, the warmth of another body, without crowding him. She explained how to time one's movements to create near misses, moments where hands almost touched, where bodies nearly collided, where possibility hung in the air like perfume. When she demonstrated how to properly accept assistance into a carriage, the lesson became almost unbearably intimate. She played Edmund first, extending her hand with formal courtesy, explaining how the touch should communicate protection without possession. Then she switched roles, showing how Amelia should place her hand in his, not limply like a dead fish, not graspingly like a drowning woman, but with trust and grace. As Josephine placed her hand in an imaginary Edmund's, her face softened with such longing that this author's heart actually ached. She stood there, hand extended to no one, eyes seeing someone who wasn't there, and in that moment looked more beautiful than either of her sisters had ever been. Edmund, watching from the garden through the morning room windows, pressed his palm against the glass so hard this author feared it might shatter. His expression was that of a man watching everything he had ever wanted perform for someone else. The gardener would later report to Cook, who naturally reported to this author's source, that his lordship remained at that window for nearly an hour after the lesson concluded, long after both sisters had left the room. When finally roused from his reverie by a passing rainstorm, Edmund apparently walked through the entire downpour without noticing, arriving at his carriage thoroughly soaked, yet seeming entirely unaware of his condition. His valet later confided that his lordship spent that entire evening staring at nothing, occasionally murmuring lines from Wordsworth under his breath, behavior so unusual that the servants began to worry he had contracted a brain fever. The crisis came during the 5th week when Edmund could bear no more. He arrived for his official call unexpectedly early, catching the sisters mid-lesson. Josephine had been demonstrating how to discuss literature without seeming pretentious, holding one of Edmund's favorite volumes, a first edition of Donne's poetry that she had somehow procured. She was explaining the metaphysical conceit of the flea, her face alight with genuine enthusiasm as she detailed how Donne used the mundane to explore the profound, how the most unlikely vehicles could carry the deepest truths. She spoke of layers of meaning, of the dance between the literal and figurative, of how true understanding required looking beyond surface interpretations. Amelia sat with the glazed expression of someone who had stopped listening approximately 3 minutes ago, but Josephine was too lost in her subject to notice. She was, this author realized, no longer teaching Amelia at all. She was simply sharing her joy in something she loved, and that joy transformed her entirely. The transformation in her when Edmund entered was heartbreaking. This author watched her shutter her intelligence like closing a shop for the night. The light in her eyes dimmed, her animated gestures stilled, her voice flattened to the monotone appropriate for an invisible middle sister. She murmured something about fetching refreshments and fled, leaving Edmund staring after her with an expression of such naked longing that even oblivious Amelia noticed. What followed was a comedy of errors that Shakespeare himself would have envied. Edmund began arriving for every lesson, though he maintained his concealment. He would torture himself, watching Josephine teach her sister how to capture his heart, all while falling desperately for the teacher rather than the pupil. His official visits with Amelia became increasingly painful. The poor girl would attempt to implement Josephine's lessons with all the grace of a cow attempting ballet. She would begin a sentence about Wordsworth, forget halfway through what she was supposed to say, and end with something about how lovely daffodils were for decorating breakfast tables. She would try to create meaningful proximity, and instead step on Edmund's feet or spill tea on his waistcoat. Meanwhile, Josephine grew increasingly frustrated with Amelia's inability to execute even the simplest strategies. During one particularly exasperating session, after Amelia had confused Wordsworth with Wadsworth, whoever that might be, for the 5th time, Josephine's composure finally cracked. She declared that perhaps she should just marry Edmund herself, since she seemed to be the only one who understood him. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and the silence that followed was deafening. Amelia stared at her sister with dawning comprehension, seeing perhaps for the first time past her own concerns to the pain beneath Josephine's practical facade. Josephine turned white, then red, then fled the room with a speed that suggested the hounds of hell were pursuing her. Neither sister noticed Edmund in the hallway, looking as if he had been struck by lightning. He stood there for a full minute, hand raised to knock on a door he no longer needed to enter, understanding flooding through him like water through a broken dam. The situation reached its crescendo at the Hartwell Ball, the event where Edmund was expected to formally announce his engagement to Amelia. The entire ton had gathered, eager to witness the union of beauty and nobility, though this author suspects many came hoping for disaster instead. Nothing quite entertains society like watching others' plans crumble. The Hartwell ballroom had been transformed at enormous expense into what Mrs. Hartwell fondly imagined was a bower of earthly delights, but more closely resembled what might happen if a flower shop exploded. Every surface groaned under the weight of roses, lilies, and somewhat optimistically orange blossoms. The heat from 500 candles, combined with the press of bodies, created an atmosphere that could only be described as tropical. Josephine had dressed with even more deliberate plainness than usual, as if trying to disappear entirely into the wallpaper. She wore gray silk that should have rendered her invisible, but somehow only emphasized her attempts at concealment. The gown was cut high to the neck, long in the sleeve, and devoid of any ornament save a single pearl pin that had been her grandmother's. She stationed herself behind a cluster of matrons, clearly planning to avoid the announcement entirely. Edmund appeared precisely at 9, resplendent in black evening clothes that made him look like a particularly attractive storm cloud gathering on the horizon. He dutifully asked Amelia for the first dance, a quadrille that he performed with all the enthusiasm of someone undergoing a tooth extraction. But his eyes, gentle listeners, his eyes never left Josephine. He tracked her movements around the room like a compass finding north. He watched her help Rose with a torn hem, kneeling on the ballroom floor without regard for her own gown. He observed her quietly directing servants to refresh the punch when her mother was too busy accepting congratulations to notice. He saw her gently redirect an elderly aunt who had become confused and was looking for a card room that didn't exist. The second dance went to Rose out of courtesy, though Edmund barely seemed to notice her chatter about the latest fashion in sleeve lengths. The third to his mother from obligation, the dowager making pointed comments about announcements and appropriate timing that Edmund pretended not to hear. But when the fourth dance began, a waltz, that most intimate of dances, Edmund did something unprecedented. He walked directly through the crowd, cutting through conversations like a ship through water. He passed Amelia, who stood ready with her dance card and an expression of martyred preparation. He ignored the titled ladies angling for his attention, including Lady Sarah Ponsonby, whose décolletage was so ambitious it threatened to create an international incident. He walked straight to the corner where Josephine was attempting to become one with a potted fern that had seen better days. The entire ballroom held its breath as he extended his hand to the middle Hartwell sister. Josephine stared at his gloved fingers as if they might bite. Her eyes darted to Amelia, to her mother, who looked like she might spontaneously combust, to the assembled crowd of London's finest gossips, all leaning forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The orchestra, bless them, continued playing, though half the violinists were craning to see what would happen. This author observed the exact moment Josephine decided to stop hiding. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and she placed her hand in his with a grace that made every other woman in the room look clumsy by comparison. What followed was not just a dance, but a complete revelation. They moved together as if they had been partners for years, every step perfectly synchronized, every turn revealing another layer of connection. Edmund held her as if she were simultaneously precious and unbreakable, his hand at her waist firm but gentle, his frame providing support without constraint. Josephine, meanwhile, had shed her camouflage entirely. The gray gown that had seemed so plain suddenly appeared elegant in its simplicity. Her hair, though still severely pinned, caught the candlelight and revealed hidden threads of gold and copper. Her face, usually carefully neutral, showed every emotion: surprise, fear, hope, and finally, inevitably, love. They danced as if alone in the ballroom, unaware or uncaring that 500 people watched in stunned silence. This author heard Lady Jersey whisper to Lady Cowper that she had never seen anything quite like it. And considering Lady Jersey's extensive experience with scandal, that was saying something. When the waltz ended, Edmund did not release her. Instead, in full view of London society, including his mother who looked ready to have an apoplectic fit, he made his declaration. He announced that he had learned something valuable over the past weeks. He spoke of discovering that love could not be taught or learned like a lesson from a book. It came upon one suddenly, usually while watching someone demonstrate the very qualities one never knew one was seeking. He had been observing. Here he paused to look directly at Josephine, the most remarkable teacher, and found himself the student instead. He spoke of watching her reveal her true self while teaching another to impersonate it, of seeing her demonstrate affections he desperately wanted for himself, of recognizing in her the partner he had never dared hope to find. He confessed to hiding outside doorways like a lovesick boy, tortured by proximity to what he wanted but couldn't have. The uproar was immediate and spectacular. Mrs. Hartwell fainted into Mr. Hartwell's arms with such force she nearly knocked him over. The Dowager Marchioness demanded to know what was happening in tones that could have frozen hellfire. Rose began applauding before being shushed by an aunt who then started applauding herself. But Amelia, surprising everyone, stepped forward. She announced with remarkable composure that she released Lord Edmund from their engagement as she had realized they would not suit. She further stated that she intended to marry Mr. Morrison, who had just inherited a comfortable living from a distant relation, a detail she had kept secret for dramatic effect. This author must confess to requiring her fan at this point, so overwhelming was the drama unfolding. Mr. Morrison himself appeared from the crowd, having been hidden behind a pillar for the entire evening, and dropped to one knee before Amelia in full view of everyone. His proposal, while lacking Edmund's eloquence, had the virtue of sincere devotion, and Amelia's acceptance was the first truly genuine emotion this author had seen from her. Edmund turned back to Josephine, who stood frozen in the center of the ballroom like a deer caught in lamplight. He asked, with a humility that no one had ever heard from him before, if she might consider a man who had been too blind to see what was before him until she literally taught him how to recognize love. Josephine's response was worth the entire evening's entertainment. She observed that he had certainly taken his time reaching the obvious conclusion that his powers of observation were clearly lacking if he needed 5 weeks of lessons to recognize what should have been apparent from their first meeting, and that she supposed someone had to marry him, if only to save other innocent young ladies from his terrible conversation skills. She then added, more softly, that she had loved him from the moment he noticed her trying not to laugh at Amelia's definition of political as very political, that watching him watch her had been the most exquisite torture of her life, and that if he ever hid outside another door to spy on her, she would know immediately because she had memorized the sound of his breathing. The kiss that followed this decidedly unromantic, yet deeply romantic acceptance was enough to make even the most hardened society matron reach for her handkerchief. This author, along with half the ton, required immediate access to smelling salts. They were married 8 weeks later in a double ceremony with Amelia and Mr. Morrison, which Mrs. Hartwell insisted upon to save expense, and which resulted in the most interesting wedding London had seen in decades. Edmund's vows included a promise to never again fail to see what was right before his eyes, and to always appreciate the teacher more than the lesson. Josephine promised to never again hide her light under a bushel of gray silk, and to always tell him when he was being insufferably arrogant, which Edmund noted might take up considerable time. Josephine wore a gown of deep amber that made her glow like autumn sunshine, finely dressed to be seen rather than overlooked. When she walked down the aisle, this author heard more than one gentleman wonder aloud how they had never noticed her before, causing their wives to elbow them sharply in the ribs. Their marriage became legendary, not for its grandeur, but for its genuine partnership. Edmund discovered that being married to someone who found him frequently absurd, but loved him anyway, was far more satisfying than being worshipped. Josephine found that being visible to one person who truly saw her was worth more than being admired by thousands who didn't. They had 4 children, all of whom inherited their mother's observation skills and their father's unfortunate tendency toward arrogance, making for very interesting family dinners where the children would correct their father's statements with citations from books, and their mother would hide her laughter behind her napkin. This author has had the pleasure of attending several of their gatherings, where the conversation ranges from philosophy to the proper way to prepare tea, with Josephine still occasionally demonstrating some point, while Edmund watches her with the same mesmerized expression he wore during those secret lessons. He has been known to declare, after several glasses of port, that marrying one's teacher was the best education a man could receive. As for Amelia and her Mr. Morrison, they lived quite happily in their modest vicarage, producing 3 cheerful children who inherited their mother's beauty and their father's love of Greek poetry, though mercifully not his talent for writing it. Society eventually forgave the scandal, especially after Josephine became one of London's most sought-after hostesses, known for gatherings where conversation was actually interesting and beauty was not the only currency that mattered. The Dowager Marchioness, after recovering from her initial apoplexy, was heard to say that she had always known Josephine was the superior sister and had arranged the entire situation to bring them together, a claim so obviously false that even she didn't seem to believe it. However, she did develop a genuine fondness for her daughter-in-law, particularly after Josephine produced an heir within the first year of marriage. Rose, the youngest Hartwell sister, used the scandal of her sister's unconventional marriages to her advantage, declaring that since her family had already weathered such storms, she might as well marry for love too. She subsequently eloped with an artist, causing Mrs. Hartwell to take permanently to her bed, and Mr. Hartwell to increase his brandy consumption, though both were seen at their grandson's christening looking remarkably pleased with themselves. And so, gentle listeners, another tale reaches its blessed conclusion. Sometimes the best love stories begin not with attraction, but with education, not with passion, but with patience, not with the student one expects, but with the teacher one never saw coming. This author withdraws until our next encounter, leaving you with this thought: perhaps we all need someone to teach us how to love them, but the wisest among us learn to love the teacher instead of the lesson. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most invisible people cast the longest shadows, and the quietest voices speak the loudest truths. Until then, remember, the greatest scandals often lead to the greatest happiness, and sometimes the best matches are the ones nobody saw coming, especially when they were hiding in plain sight all along. Your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.